everyone, and welcome to another edition of Gray Batter. I'm really excited about today's program because it's going to be a bit of a change of pace. Those of you who saw the interview we did with Kim Moody of Moody's Tax in Calgary, I think really got a treat. We got to speak with somebody who is an experienced tax professional, but who also was able to talk about a lot of different aspects of the economy and some very distressing things that are going on in the world, in the financial world, not only domestically in Canada, but also internationally. Well, today we have a show in the similar vein. We've got a show I've entitled The Alchemist. Those of you who don't know what that is, well, there's a legend of the man who could turn other metals magically into gold. Well, we're not going to put that kind of pressure on our guest today, Bernie Robitaille, but he is an expert in the world of gold, and he is with Worldwide Precious Metals. And so we're going to hopefully learn some things about precious metals. The theme of our show, as you know, is always freedom. So today we're going to talk a little bit about how perhaps we can help people achieve financial freedom and to gain some knowledge about how they can do that, and perhaps making precious metals a part of a plan that could make them feel more free, more secure in their personal financial dealings. So just by way of introduction, as we always do, we have a few quotations to frame our discussion. And in the honor of our guest, we've got a few that have a distinct golden theme. Nothing here from James Bond. However, we do have something from a famous philosopher named Thomas Fuller, who famously wrote, "It is much better to have your gold in the hand than in the heart." The second one is, "Gold is money. Everything else is credit." That's from J.P. Morgan, one of the titans of the American Gilded Age in the 19th century, really one of the financial builders of the American economy that people know today. And then lastly, we have from the poet and essayist Ralph Waldo Emerson, who famously wrote that the desire for gold is not for gold, it is for the means of freedom and benefit. And that's what we're talking about today. So who do we have? Well, we have Bernie Robitaille. Bernie is currently the managing partner of Worldwide Precious Metals Canada, but he has a very diverse and distinguished business history, especially in Alberta and in Edmonton. Previously, he was president and CEO of the Press Gallery and director of the Alberta Textile Care Association, and was often asked to give presentations on behalf of that industry. He relocated to Edmonton in 1976 and entered the dry cleaning business. In 1987, he says he was in that business for 30 years to the day. He was awarded Dry Cleaner of the Year 2011 and recognized with the Shining Star Award in 2012 for his work with the Certified Restoration Dry Cleaning Network of Detroit. The Press Gallery had sponsored Edmonton Opera since 1999 and has also been a board member of Edmonton Opera for 6 years. And my understanding is, obviously, he has an affinity for opera, which is something that I don't know if he knows this, but we share. Bernie also served in the military from 1979 to 1984. Bernie brings his exceptional entrepreneurial experience and skills to Zenus, and has been very active as a major shareholder with the company since 2012. Bernie also originally is from North Bay, Ontario, and he has a stepson, Michael, who resides in Dubai, a daughter, Catherine, and a son, Patrick. And he's passionate about diamond and bullion investing, and he enjoys sporting events and traveling. He served in the Canadian Forces for 5 years, including a tour with NATO. Later, he was a construction supervisor from 1984 to 1987. And as we said, he entered the dry cleaning business back in 1987. So, Bernie, welcome to the program.
Well, thank you, Leighton. That was a great introduction. I hardly recognize myself. Appreciate that.
I have that problem whenever I look at old pictures of myself, and then when I look in the mirror. So, Bernie, thanks so much for being with us today. I know we're going to learn a lot from you. Just so there's full disclosure, Bernie is he's my advisor. He has been my advisor for a few years now in terms of precious metals. I knew nothing about precious metals before I became Bernie's client, and I can vouch for him all the way to the moon and back is somebody who is knowledgeable and who's generous with his time and knowledge. Everything is highly professional and service oriented. And that's a big reason why I wanted to have him on the show, because he's the kind of person that we can learn from. I think most people are mystified by the concept of precious metals. Of course, we're all fascinated by gold. I think that's in our DNA. But hopefully we can turn that fascination into some knowledge about how we can use precious metals as a means of building wealth and building some security and some financial freedom. So coming back to Bernie. Bernie has a very interesting family history. I'd like him to talk about a little bit, going back to his school days. One of the things that I learned about Bernie that's really, really interesting is his family history with the infamous Avro Arrow project. And I'm hoping Bernie's going to touch on that. So Bernie, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself, where you're from, and your personal history, family history, and how you ended up in Edmonton, running a dry cleaning business and getting into the trading and investment of worldwide precious metals?
Well, certainly, and I must say, I didn't get up one day thinking I was going to become a dry cleaner or in the precious metals business as a broker with such a large firm. But yes, going back to my family history, my father had a specialty trade in the Air Force. His IQ apparently was off the charts, and he kept getting targeted for some specialty trades. And one of the stories that amazes me about my father is during the Avro Arrow program development stage, he was tasked to be a technician and to help with the Iroquois engine. The Avro Arrow never, ever actually flew with the Iroquois engine. It only ever flew with, I believe, a borrowed engine from the Rolls-Royce company. And of course, as we know from our history, before it ever flew with the engine that was custom designed for it, even though it had already broken all types of thrust ratios, speed ratios, altitude ratios at that point with the borrowed engine, and never got to fly with the new engine. And of course, Diefenbaker, for a number of different reasons, ended up chopping up or having it ordered, chopped up, and thrown in the lake. And on a side note, I believe my father has never voted conservative from that day on. I think he took it a little bit personally. But then he went on to work on the new Bulwark missile defense system. And I don't know if he ever made it to the DEW line or not, but my dad was, and he couldn't tell us what he was doing back then because it was considered secret. But my father was a trained technician, depending on the threat levels from the Cold War, on converting the missiles from conventional to nuclear on our defense, for defense posture. So that was really interesting. And I didn't find that out about my dad for about 15, 20 years ago, when our Prime Minister Martin was in question period, and he accidentally let it slip that we did have thermal nuclear capabilities, and my dad was finally able to release what he was doing in the Air Force after the Avro Arrow program. So that was really interesting.
Wow. I watched a program, I believe it's on YouTube. It was a documentary about the Avro Arrow that was made in the early 70s, right, back when CBC used to actually produce informative and useful programming. And anyway, I'm told it's one of the best documentaries ever done on the Avro Arrow. And I was really astonished at how far ahead of its time that project was, the technology that they had. And then I understand, going back about 5 or 6 years ago, is it true that they found parts of a plane or maybe most of a plane intact in Lake Ontario? But I didn't follow up to see whether that was actually recovered. Do you know, Bernie?
I did happen to spot that story. They had finally located where they had been dumped in Lake Ontario, and they had recovered a few pieces, but keep in mind, it had been chopped up quite significantly. So whether or not they're ever able to reconstruct it and get enough pieces up, that I've lost the tail end of that story. And I'm sure they're looking for investors to do that with, I'm sure. But that would be fun to get an actual Avro Arrow back on dry soil and in some type of museum where people can touch it and just kind of rekindle our history with it. I think that'd be fantastic. And your mention about breaking all types of records, I also understand that it wasn't until the Tomcat, the F-15, was developed by the Americans some 30 some odd plus years later did that plane come close to achieving what the Arrow had already achieved with our Canadian engineers. And of course, a lot of the engineers, now my father wasn't an engineer, but a lot of the engineers ended up being asked to go over to Cape Canaveral, and they were instrumental in helping with the moonshot that John F. Kennedy, the president at that time, wanted to do, and he got some great talents out of that program. So we lost a plane, and he got his moonshot, as far as I'm concerned. Yeah.
So you were an Air Force brat, traveling around and living in different places, and ultimately you decided to come out to Alberta in 1976, though.
That's right. Well, I was only 14. I didn't speak a word of English. A lot of people claim I still don't speak English, by the way. I didn't speak a word of English, and my father got transferred out there. And oddly enough, he had quit the Air Force by then. So this was a private venture that brought him out here. He ended up going back federally when he joined the corrections offices here in Edmonton. But at that time, it was a private venture that brought him out. So I started learning English in grade 9 at St. Cecilia here in Edmonton, and then finally graduating from O'Leary in 1979, 1980, I guess it was. And I learned English on the fly, and that's how I learned to speak English. And but that was great. And of course, I consider Edmonton home. I lived in 14 different places in the first 14 years of my life. So you can imagine I don't have much more of a place to call home than I do Edmonton. And I just absolutely love it here. I love the community. I love the business spirit here.
That story of how you learned English reminds me of the novelist Joseph Conrad, who famously wrote The Heart of Darkness. He was actually Polish. He was a merchant seaman and didn't hear a word of English until he was about 16, 17 years old. And then he picked it up, and he picked up many languages traveling around. But it's funny, when you're young enough, when you're immersed in a language, how well you can pick it up. And obviously you're testament to that. Evidently you're no slouch in the IQ department yourself. But turning to precious metals, which is what you're here to talk about, because I've given you the label of the alchemist. So I'm curious to know, and I'm sure the people listening are, how and why did you become involved in precious metals after such a long career as a dry cleaner?
Well, certainly. And just before we get to that, I want to refer back to 3 people that you had great interviews with. That is going to segue into what we're going to talk about.
Fantastic. I love this. Is great. It gives the illusion that there's some sense of order and structure in what I'm doing.
Yeah,
Thank you, Bernie. Thank you, Bernie.
Right to the station here for a second. So it's Jeff Rapp. Well, I mean, what an lawyer, and of course you know him very well. I've never had the privilege of meeting him personally, but him and Brian St. Clair's summary on inflation, and you can call it a little bit of a vent or a rant if you want, but they really spilt the beans on inflation, where they felt that it came from. So that's really going to segue nice into our discussion. And then of course Kim Moody. I mean, how can you replace what he had to say? I think that was earlier this week or last week when you did this interview with him, and it was absolutely fantastic. And to frame our discussion, I think it's really important that people understand there's not one single individual out there that totally understands the currency markets, totally understands the investment markets. It's such a complex, large beast. Anybody who claims that they completely understand it is fooling themselves and others. And I think it's really important that as we have this discussion, that people keep a really open mind to all of the possibilities. All you and I can talk about really is what we're aware that is happening, a possible solution to what's happening, but we can never, ever predict the future with any type of solution. I think it's important that we cover that off a little bit. And of course, I want to make sure nobody takes any of this as investment advice as we're chatting through. So now it's
totally information.
Totally information, and maybe a little bit of entertainment as things go. So no, that is great. So how did I get into precious metals? Well, I'm a little bit of an accidental tourist when it comes to that. Of course, I was serving in the military, and back then, especially when I was in NATO, our life expectancy, they kept telling us and drilling into us, was 20 seconds. You're just there to take the first bullet, that type of stuff. So you can imagine we didn't plan a lot of future with that being drilled into your head all the time. And so after I left the military, I partnered up with a really good friend of mine, actually ended up being the best man at my wedding as well. And we started, I joined him on some construction ventures. And this is where my journey starts. There was basically stagflation. So you had really, really high interest rates, and you had really, really low unemployment. The economy was really stagnant, and we were trying to struggle through with a construction business. And the venture didn't turn out so well for us. I ended up holding 10 properties for years and years and years and carrying all those finance charges. And back then, I remember my first personal home interest rates were 16%, something like that.
Wow.
And then I decided, well, actually, my business partner, who I was in construction with, he decided that there was money in dry cleaning. So there's always a hot idea out there. He thought that there was money in dry cleaning, and there was a franchise opportunity. So he and I decided we're going to do this. As it turns out, I got the keys, and I say I had the keys because he ended up doing construction. He never did really work the business, and it turns out that I enjoyed it tremendously, I must say. So that was that actually turned out to be a good miss on my part. But I opened up the keys to my first business on October 19th, 1987. Are you familiar with that date?
Oh, yeah, that was the tornado.
No, that was actually July of that year.
Okay.
No, October 19th was Black Monday in the stock market.
Oh, yes.
Here we go. And
Yeah.
it was the worst wipeout since the Great Depression or something.
Yeah.
So here I am, I'm 25 years old. I've got this nice polished counter. I'm all ready to go. I got equipment. I got a couple of staff members, and nothing's happening. I mean, on opening day, nothing is happening. And I couldn't figure out. And I was so engrossed in opening my business and getting things ready, I wasn't paying attention to the news. It wasn't until later that day that the headline said, business failures, worst stock market since the Great Depression, and of course, all the doom and gloom that came with that. So that was my start in my venture in that business. And then over 10 years, I spent most of the money that I accumulated, I invested back in the business, mostly because of the experience of Black Monday. I wanted to have control of my financing, opened up a couple of post offices, expanded to a couple of different branches. And then just before the dot-com bubble, I had enough money left over to start investing in the stock market again, if you can believe it. So I put some money in, but I had an advisor who said, Bernie, we really have to look at gold. He says, I feel like something isn't right. I want to put a percentage of your portfolio in gold. And after the dot-com bubble burst and things shattered, I went back and looked through my financial statements over 18 months, and I realized that the only thing that had performed well was my precious metals position. Now, that was all paper because I didn't understand the distinction between ETFs, paper exposure, and physical at that stage. So that really piqued my interest. So I continued growing my business. And then, of course, we get over to the financial crisis of 2008. I have a lot more money in the market. But by then, I also learned the difference between physical and paper. And that's when I opened up my account with Worldwide Precious Metals, as it turns out. I started stacking or acquiring physical metals. And then when the great financial crisis occurred, starting in October 2008 and lasted for 2-3 years before things settled down, I again did very, very well. But this time I owned the physical metals rather than the paper. And as we have a discussion, we'll talk about what the differences are in those two asset classes, because they are somewhat different. And then all of a sudden, I survived that. I survived the great financial crisis. And 30 years later, I get approached by an equity firm here in Edmonton, and they ended up buying my company. At first, I didn't have a lot of interest in selling my company. I was really enjoying myself. I was sponsoring the Edmonton Opera. I was doing a whole bunch of things in the community. It afforded me to do it. But it turns out that my succession plan, my son joining me in the business, wasn't working out. He was enjoying his academics as a civil engineering so much, he made it very clear that he wouldn't be taking on the business. Then Fort McMurray blew up, and I had a large insurance book of business. The equity firm approached me again. We settled on terms, and I helped roll over my position into some qualified personnel. I ended up basically being semi-retired, and then all of a sudden I get a call from Worldwide Precious Metals, the founder John Downs and the president Tom Beggs, and they asked me what I was doing and how I was holding out. And I explained to them that I was bleeding out cash. I'd gained 15 pounds and I was bored stiff, and the rest of this. And I did remind them that I hadn't been an employee since 1984, so I certainly wasn't coming on board to be an employee. So I became managing partner and opened up the Edmonton office. And that's how I became involved with precious metals.
Fantastic. You know, as I was listening to you, Bernie, it occurred to me how curious it is that the stock market crashes always seem to happen in October. October of of 29, October of 87, and October of 08. There seems to be something to this.
Maybe there is, yeah. And it seems to cycle almost every 10 years, doesn't it? So, so that'll be interesting.
Yeah, and this time we got, I guess it was a bit more than 10 years, and then we got COVID. One of the things that I'd like you to do, Bernie, and I know that you are knowledgeable in this regard, could you give us a short thumbnail sketch of the gold trade and its historical significance? Because I think a lot of people, of course, we know what gold is. We know it's a precious metal. We know something about it, but in terms of its importance and its significance as a method of trade, could you give us kind of a Coles Notes explanation of that?
Sure, and of course, I'll never do it justice in 5-10 minutes, but certainly
you take as much time as you need.
Okay. So
I'm curious.
Yeah, no, fair enough. Going back, I guess the best way for me to start is to go back when we became civilized, as they say. I think the definition of civilization is we didn't have to be hunter-gatherers all the time. We could actually be stationary in a place and grow wheat and harvest our food and bring up animals so that we could bring them to the slaughter and we could eat. Well, different people had different trades, so it was all based on barter. Somebody had a tool that you needed to farm, you'd give them part of the grains that you would harvest. But that was very, very inefficient. Nobody could really understand what was fair value. So it wasn't until they started minting actually predominantly silver, more so than gold. And it might be interesting for people to know that there's been a silver standard much longer than a gold standard.
Oh, really?
We are going to focus on the gold standard only because that's our history over the last 100 years, and we want to keep things a little current. And I don't want to go down too many rabbit holes either. But the very first coin that they ever found is 2,700 years old, and it is the Lydian lion coin. And believe it or not, it was the hub of activity. It was Istanbul. It was Turkey. And we forget how important the Middle East has been in trade over our history. We think it's all about the West these days, and we kind of forget our history. But they had their first coin. And as a matter of fact, I don't have a Lydia coin, but I do have an old Greek coin that's 2,400 years old.
Really? Wow.
It's silver. It's silver. It's a precious metal. And with that, a couple of things were able to happen. Countries were able to trade with each other now. Now you had a fungible token, you had a fungible value, so you could put into it when you were doing more global trades across borders instead of just bartering within farms. And this unfortunately also brought on what we call taxation, because taxation was very difficult until they started minting coins. But it also was the foundation of our banking system. Until we started minting coins, there were really no reasons for banks. So it's hard to hold a commodity like a grain inside of a vault and say that it has value. So there was no need for the banking system. That all came out of precious metals and specifically coins, mostly silver. And the first bankers were actually religious temples. And why that was is because you trusted the monks, you trusted the religious persons with your wealth, with your financial wealth, with your gold and with your silver. And they actually started trading. They actually started giving out loans. So that was the foundation of the banking system. So we went from the first coins to religious temples being the first bankers, and they would do money exchanges. They would bring you better quality of coins as they became to purify them more. And of course, there's a famous biblical story about our Lord Jesus Christ basically going to Jerusalem,
fashioning the whip.
Yes, fashioning the whips, and and beat up on what turned out to be our future bankers and so for whatever reason, he had an axe to grind, and that was over 2,000 years ago. So that became really interesting. Then we're going to fast forward to the gold is more concentrated. It's a more concentrated form of wealth. It's rarer than silver. So empires, if you want to call it that, whether they were royals or whatever their political system was, started hoarding or acquiring gold as a way of paying their militaries to protect their trade routes. And then, of course, they would go to war because they were the ones that had gold. But one of the benefits of gold is it allowed countries to exchange fair values for services during peacetime. And if one country had a lot of gold, they had a lot of deflation because they were able to pay for products and services that were offered from another country. But as soon as their gold started to deplenish, they either had to go out and acquire another country and use their gold to build armies to do it that way, or they would trade with another country that they had a peace agreement with. And then they were going through inflation, but as they started to trade with the country that had most of the gold previously, you started to funnel. It was just this beautiful balance where inflation and deflation between countries would go up and down depending on who had the gold at any given time. Mm-hmm. Then we went through a phase, and England, of course, had the reserve currency. They had most of the gold. They were able to protect their trade routes with ships and a very mobile army. A lot of people think that the British army was always large. It wasn't large. It was just mobile. They used their navies to give them tactical advantages. And sometimes they would use their military to protect what they had, and other times they'd use their military, as we know, to acquire things that maybe that they didn't have. And it's interesting. I looked up one time. I'm a historian when it comes to the military a little bit. I looked up one time, and Britain had invaded or taken possession of, by proxy or directly, about 90% of the countries that are represented in the UN today. I don't think there's any other empire that has that record, but that's of interest. And they started the gold back, or the pure gold standard, as you would call it. You would be able to redeem their paper English pounds for a full ounce of gold. And then World War I came along, and of course, Britain ended up on the front lines of World War I, and they needed a lot of military equipment. So they went to North America, predominantly the United States. They paid for a lot of the war supplies that they needed in gold. So a lot of the gold ended up being shipped to the United States, which is really important as to how we get to the United States having the reserve currency over time. And then, of course, France, if you're being invaded and you're at risk of actually being overrun, you're going to ship all of your gold offshore. So all of those European countries that are being attacked by Germany ship most of their gold maybe to England initially, but eventually also to the United States. So England started having a weakness in their English pound because they didn't have enough gold to back up their English pound. And that was a direct result of that war, really. And then we went to what we call the gold exchange system, where it was only fractional gold, about 50% of gold to support an English pound or a US dollar. We went into a gold exchange program, and then World War II hit. And that basically took the last of the gold out of England, took all of the gold out of European countries. It was all shipped to the United States. So the United States was sitting on all of the gold, most of it that they own now, because those European countries, England, France, had to pay for that war effort in gold. Gold was money back then. And then after the war, the United States really came out on top. They really weren't destroyed. They didn't have to use their gold to rebuild their industry. That, unfortunately, was a negative to the European countries, and we went into what we call a Bretton Woods system, and that's roughly about every dollar or pound being backed by about 25% gold. So that brings us to a fiat currency. It's not quite fiat yet. It's backed by 25% roughly in gold, but because the United States had most of the gold, we went into a reserve. The United States became the reserve currency through the Bretton Woods Agreement. I think it's important for people to understand that wasn't immediate overnight. The English pound and the US dollar kind of shared reserve status for a while, and that's really quite common. It's not a break just in one day in the calendar. So it is kind of important. That's going to come up in our discussion a little later on how gold plugs into any future currency models as well. So then we went to the Bretton Woods system. But what happened because of the gun and butter economy in the United States? They started their social programs. They fought a war in Vietnam, and they wanted to do the moonshot that we've already kind of talked about. They started printing more money than they were allowed, more fiat currency than they were allowed that could be backed by gold. And France was the first one to call them on it. They says, look, we've got all these US dollars. You've promised to give us X amount of gold for it. We want you to be good on delivery on that gold. And that's when Nixon basically says, look, the gig is up. We've been caught on this. That's not the first time in history. We'll talk about another time here shortly, but he got caught. So he basically decoupled gold from the US dollar, and the US dollar became officially a fiat currency. And a fiat currency is not backed by any hard asset, and that allowed him to print it almost to infinity to continue fighting the wars. And of course, we'll talk about inflation and how that all came about as well. Mm-hmm. And then they became the petrodollar, and that's what saved the US dollar. So they went from a gold partial standard under the Bretton Woods system to a petrodollar. And that becomes really important because it kind of demystifies why the United States gets engaged in so many wars in possibly in the Middle East and whatnot. And a lot of that is to preserve not only the petrodollar and the petrol, but I suspect that was also part of the agreement that Kissinger negotiated with the Emirates in Saudi Arabia, predominantly, and OPEC, saying, look, we want you to enforce that you will only sell oil in the US dollar, which will secure our reserve status, even though we've decoupled from gold. However, we will also offer you protection. It wasn't quite written and spoken that way, but it was understood. And that's how we ended up with what we're dealing with today. It's basically the petrodollar, but a completely fiat currency system.
Wow, that's a fascinating history. And it also, you hit so many interesting points. One of the things that you mentioned, Bernie, that I just became aware of somewhat recently is the other side of history in terms of Eastern history and commerce. I read a book. It's called the Silk Roads, which I'd recommend, and it does talk about the Ottoman Empire and Turkish Empire and things like that, and how important those were in terms of developing modern what we know today as modern history and modern economies. So coming back to what you do, though, Worldwide Precious Metals. So what is the mission of Worldwide Precious Metals? What does your company do exactly?
So our sole role is to offer physical precious metals in different forms with different options available for storage to our clients, and to do it very cost efficiently. And a lot of people, when they decide to get into the market, they really don't know where to start. They can phone Worldwide Precious Metals. We demystify it very, very quickly. It's surprisingly efficient. Basically, what you're doing is you're changing fiat currency paper into actual money, physical gold, silver, palladium, and platinum, and we facilitate that trade for the client, whether they want to take a home delivery or if they want to use a vaulting service. What we are not, and this is just as important as what we are, we're not a bullion bank. We do not own the deposits. We don't speculate with the product, so we don't hypothecate it. We don't carry any risk against it. There's no counterparty risk whatsoever. You own the physical metals. We are just there to help facilitate the process to convert your fiat currency into physical metals, and then you have a choice as to whether or not you want it home delivered or vaulted. Even if you choose vaulted, you can stand for delivery at any time. It's 100% yours.
Okay. So we talked a lot about the relationship, or a little bit about, I should say, about the relationship between gold and currency. I do know that the values of precious metals fluctuate from time to time. So what are the precise factors that determine the price of gold at any given time?
Right. So it's a combination of factors. There are some that are a little bit more crucial than others. Definitely a depreciating fiat currency is probably one of the major drivers. When people feel that their currency is not buying them what it used to buy, they will go to a precious metals as a hedge against that inflation. That's definitely one of the big drivers. On a more technical aspect, negative real interest rates, and for those who don't understand that term, is when you are able to buy a bond that pays you 2 or 3% interest, but inflation is running posted at 8.5%, and there's a lot of arguments it's a lot higher than that, but let's stick with that for a second. You're actually underwater by about 5%. So you're gaining 3% interest from the bond or the treasury bill that you bought, but inflation's rolling away at 8.5%. So the net difference there is a 5% loss to you. That will be a big driver to gold. there's some psychology there, because currently a lot of people don't believe that the Fed won't be able to tackle and inflation, I should say. So what ends up happening is if people believe that inflation will be tackled, they don't necessarily run to gold immediately. So there's a lag effect. There's the reality of the rarity of gold. All gold in the world can fit in an Olympic-sized pool. That absolutely surprises people.
Really?
I think there's another stat where there's more iron poured in the world in 1 hour than has ever been mined for gold in our entire human existence. Gold grows at about the rate of the population every year, so it makes it ideal to be a medium of exchange and a storage of wealth, because it tends to keep up with the population. Fear and emotion are huge. We cannot eliminate fear out of the equation. And when gold starts to run, because of the fundamentals, you find that a lot of people jump into it, and that really drives up the price of gold. And I think that's positive in a way, except I find that a lot of clients try to buy gold as it's surging rather than buy it now when it's on sale, and we'll discuss that a little bit later as well.
Right.
Should the Federal Reserve reverse course on their interest rate rise, if they decide that they're no longer going to do quantitative tightening, if they decide that they're going to stop increasing interest rates, and people realize that they're not going to be able or are not willing to tackle inflation, that is going to be rocket fuel to gold, and then silver slingshot right by it as well. So that's going to be very positive. But those are the main factors that drive the price of gold. I think it's important at this time to mention to people, gold doesn't necessarily go up in value. Gold is being assessed against the currency you're purchasing it with. So when the impression is that gold is rising, that's usually a good sign that the currency that you are using to purchase that gold with is depreciating. So I prefer to view gold as being a static. It has value, it has intrinsic value. The currency fluctuates up and down around the price of that ounce of gold based on the debasement factor, based on the faith of that fiat currency.
So that relative stability in the value of gold is one of the benefits of owning precious metals like gold versus other types of investments. What are some other advantages that gold and precious metals have over other types of investments? Say you mentioned bonds, equities and things of that nature.
Right. So number one, and because it's a little bit more current news-wise, it's completely analog. Nobody has any way of knowing whether you are holding gold unless you offer to tell people that you're holding gold. One of the differentiator between a precious metals and, let's say, at some other form of digital asset, and I use this example because of what's going on in Ukraine right now. If you had the misfortune of living next to the Russian border and you had been overrun, but you want to get your family safely out of that zone, are you going to bribe that Russian border guard or that Russian soldier with a digital asset, or are you going to give them a gold watch or a gold ring or a gold bullion? And that's one of the fundamental differences between gold and some of the other assets. It has intrinsic value. It's viewed as money all over the world, and it is a store of value. So there's a lot of things that differentiate precious metals from other investment classes. If we wanted to talk about, actually, maybe I'll state this at this time, Leighton. One of the reasons people should be making a physical purchase of gold is as insurance on your wealth. You wouldn't drive your car without insurance. You wouldn't own your home without insurance. You wouldn't, you probably even have life insurance. But it is amazing to me how many people have a paper portfolio that they believe is diversified, but they don't have that critical insurance in the form of gold or silver or another precious metals to give them that buffer through any volatility in the paper markets. Basically, gold tends to be correlated in an opposite fashion to the paper assets. So as the perception of your stock portfolio or your bonds are going down, generally gold will react going the other way. So it preserves your wealth. There's been countless studies that have proven that a good diversified portfolio that includes a minimum, or I'm sorry, an ideal of 27 to 30% of gold outperforms just a portfolio of paper assets. And that has been back tested all the way to August 15, 1971, when Nixon removed gold from the gold standard.
And that's because of this intrinsic value that you talked about earlier.
It is. It sniffs out. I mean, one of the ways to look at it is whether you understand precisely how gold works in the bigger economic picture. All you need to know is that gold has the same purchasing power today it did 3,000 years ago, 100 years ago, and it does today. And one of the examples that I use, and I've got a couple of them, but back in the Roman Empire, if you had an ounce of gold, you could buy a Roman toga with it. Today, if you have an ounce of gold, that ounce of gold will still buy you a very, very nice suit in today's market. Mm-hmm. You don't even have to go back that far. If we go back to 1913, and the reason why I say this is that was the foundation of the Federal Reserve in the States. And I talk about them a lot because they really are the big central banks that drive a lot of these initiatives in the world. And of course, they represent the reserve currency. But in 1913, gold was pegged at $20 an ounce. A $20 US dollar bill or 1 ounce of gold bought you a nice suit back in 1913. So we're talking World War I, you can get a nice suit. Today, that $20 American bill will barely get you the buttons on that suit due to inflation eroding away the purchasing power of that dollar. But that ounce of gold still gets you a beautiful, beautiful suit. And in matter of fact, since August 15, 1971, the US dollar has lost 97% of its purchasing power, and gold has maintained it. So over time, when you stretch out the charts and you look at the financing, you don't try to do it day by day, but you stretch it out. Gold has a way of sniffing out the purchasing power of the fiat currency that it's being valued to, and that's why I say gold is static. The fiat currency that it has its purchasing power around it, it moves up and down depending on the perception of the reality of what that dollar can buy you.
I really appreciate that explanation, because I had heard it said that gold is a hedge against inflation, but I didn't really understand how it worked until you just explained it. So it's tied to this intrinsic value. So gold in a real sense is impervious to inflation, isn't it?
Well, that's exactly right. And it might be a good time to explain what money is, because a lot of people, hold on here, I've got something here for show and tell, I think. Let me pull it out.
Well, you're jumping ahead to the part of the show where you get to give us your reading list, but give us the book. I'd love to see it.
No, a lot of people make a mistake and they call this money. Okay.
Yeah.
It's fiat currency. And somebody has created up to 51 different definitions for money. And I think it's very, very important for people that are listening today, if they're not already aware, that money has to have three important features to be considered money. One, it has to be a unit of account. Second, it has to be a medium of exchange. And third, it has to be a store of value. Well, we've already established that is not a store of value. If I would have given you this $100 bill in 1913 and told you, or an ounce of gold, and I would have told you you could bury them both for 100 years, but then you can only pull one out, but you've got to pick one or the other, the smart money would have been on gold, and that would have been the absolute winner. And that's what you need to understand about how inflation erodes the value of your dollar. And it, like Ronald Reagan says, inflation is a hidden tax. Politicians can be honest about it. They can say, hey, we're going to tax back what we need to pay our debt, or we're going to allow inflation to take it away from you. And of course, humans being humans, the easier course is to allow inflation, preferably under control inflation, I understand, but allow inflation to erode the purchasing power of your dollar rather than to tax it away from you. And people need to appreciate that as well.
That's fascinating. So in terms of owning precious metals, there are different ways of doing that, aren't there? So which ones would you recommend, and under what circumstances?
Yeah, so there are a couple. There's about 4 basic ways. Now we're going to talk about the physical, I presume, at this stage.
Yes.
Yeah. So you can purchase physical premium bullion or coin. Here's a nice gold maple from the Canadian Mint and a silver maple. You can purchase it that way. You can purchase vaulted in bulk bullion form that allows you to allocate in 1 ounce increments out of industrial sized bars. That reduces the premium or fabrication cost for the gold and silver that you have in the market. You can buy a numismatic coin, something, I guess, this is a little bit of an extreme version, but a coin that is specifically minted to commemorate an event. You pay a huge premiums for those coins, but that's one way of doing it. Or you can do it in the form of jewelry. Jewelry has a lot of benefits to it, especially if you're going to be running away from your house. You need to have portable wealth. You want to bring it across borders. It is a very functional way of carrying gold. So that is the fourth way of purchasing precious metals. But there are some things that you need to be aware of. First off, if you are going to be buying bulk bullion, it has to be in allocated form. Unallocated, co-allocated, pooled, and if they're not charging you a storage fee, that is a hint that you don't necessarily have the physical metal suitable for you to stand for delivery or for immediate delivery. And that's a cautionary tale. When somebody tells me that they can go to a competitor and they won't charge a storage fee, that tells me everything I need to know about where they are in the pecking order to stand for that delivery. If you want immediate delivery, nobody is going to expend their energy, put their life on the line, and protect that gold for free. You need to be paying a storage fee for that. So that's a really important distinction if you're wondering whether or not you actually have physical metals in one of the vaults.
Okay. So in terms of worldwide precious metals, if somebody wanted to purchase gold through worldwide precious metals, what forms, what options for ownership are offered through worldwide precious metals?
Sure, the two basic options. We only really deal in bullion, so we don't deal in historical coins. We don't deal in jewelry per se. So it's basically the two types. It is a premium coin or bar form, traditionally reserved for a home delivery. You can store it that way as well, or the bulk bullion allocated. Basically, the allocated is most of our clients' preferred method of purchasing gold and silver at the moment, because the premium, partially due to COVID, partially due to labor issues, there's been some inflation, obviously, in a lot of the and a lot of the utilities to manufacture some of these premium coins and bars. The premiums have gone out of sight, especially on silver at the moment. So 98% of our clients prefer the stored option. And for a small fraction above paper, you get, and in the case of silver currently, you can go from paper to silver for 20-cent markup above spot ask. Spot ask is the paper value of silver. For 20 cents more, you can own the physical silver in bulk bullion form. You can convert that to a premium coin or bar anytime for delivery in the future. But that is a very big competitive advantage, to think that you can own precious metals, gold, silver at a small markup above the paper price, but you now own it and hold it physically. Gold, palladium, platinum is $4 above spot ask right now. So on a percentage basis, it is very small.
Bernie, one of the things that we're hearing about a lot, not only in Canada but worldwide, is the introduction of programmable currency, programmable digital currency. And this is very concerning to me, because it seems to be a very clear invasion into the freedom of individuals to spend their money as they see fit. For example, the programmable currency that already exists, I understand, in places like China, is where instead of receiving money, for example, in the form of a paycheck, what happens is you would get credits, and you're scored on a social credit system, and those credits are programmable so that the government or the issuer of that currency has control over how those credits are spent. And it seems to me that gold, fundamentally, the way you've described it, and you describe it in terms of analog, which is the opposite of digital currency, would maintain the kind of freedom that we've known, right, from being a cash-based society. Do I have that correctly, or would you disagree with that?
No, I would agree with that. Of course, you're right. China is renowned to have led the charge in that. I think before I comment too much on it, I think there's sometimes a confusion, Leighton, between cryptos and central bank digital currencies.
Right.
And
could you clarify that? Because I don't understand that. And I'm sure a lot of people are wondering too.
Right. So crypto is basically it's the blockchain technology that was developed privately. I think there's 19,000 different cryptos out there. They were developed as a means by which individuals could transact digitally, and they were really the ones that invented that technology. And of course, Bitcoin is famous for that. I think the governments have taken advantage of the comfort people have gained around crypto to start talking about and creating this digital currency. You'll notice that that they're calling it a digital currency compared to a crypto. They're going to go on top of the blockchain technology for sure, but I agree. It's going to allow governments, whether it's the Canadian government, the American government, it is going to allow these financial governments through their financial central banks to make automatic deposits have full access to your wallet. It almost bypasses the retail level bank. And I think that's a critical change that we could be experiencing coming up. It becomes completely traceable. So there'll be no fiat. There'll be no ability to withdraw a paper currency and go make a private buy somewhere. Ultimately would be their plan. It would possibly be tied to a social credit system. In other words, if they like who you're having a conversation with, or your opinions or your social media footprint, they could penalize you or reward you, as China is looking at doing. Taxes would be automatic, so you would have a lower ability to be able to decide on which deductions that you may have if they feel that you owe taxes right away. It certainly would not be private in any way whatsoever. And from an economic point of view, the feds would argue that they would be able to be more nimble in the economy. They would be able to parachute money into people's wallets more efficiently than they were able to during COVID-19. It would be easier to implement something like the universal basic income. They would be able to drop money directly into your wallet, again, bypassing the retail bank. And again, what is the scariest part of that to me is we continue to lose privacy. So I do have a concern with it. Unless something changes, I think it's inevitable. And what I love about precious metals, it remains analog. So even under a central bank digital currency, you will have the ability to hold some of your wealth privately and out of reach digitally from central governments and institutions. And I think that's critical.
So in a cash-free universe, if a person held gold and precious metals, they would still retain their intrinsic value, right? How then, though, would people be able to actually use that wealth in order to engage in trade?
Right. So there's a couple of different ways that it can be used. It can be used the traditional way, where you basically barter with it. So if you had an ounce of silver, you needed some bread and this type of stuff. It doesn't matter which country you are in the world. People understand the value of gold and silver. It is the only true form of international money. So it will always be able to be exchanged in a local currency, and you can always barter with it. And whether you carry it in the form of jewelry or in a bullion coin, you'll always have the ability to exchange that for some goods and services on the other side of that border, or to exchange it for the local currency, whatever that may be. If you choose to do it, even though maybe a digital coin, if you decide to do it that way, I'm sure that you'd have the opportunity to do it. I'm not entirely certain why you would do that, but it would be an opportunity for you to do that. One of the things I like about gold and silver because there's so much talk about reserve currency status for the US dollar and for any other type of a compatible exchange program that might come out, whether it's BRICS or whether it is the IMF coin that they're developing, is that gold, because it is the international currency, you don't have to pick a winner. You'll be able to plug and play that into any other future reserve currency. And again, I'm not one that believes that the US dollar is going to crash imminently. I don't believe that at all. I think it's going to be a slow progression. The US dollar is going to continue to debase, but it is going to retain its reserve status, I think, for quite a while to come yet. But there's going to be some compatible opportunities to have different currencies out there that may run in parallel, just like the English pound did with the US dollar back in the 40s, 30s, 40s, and 50s. I think that that's going to be an environment we're going to be in, more likely than an environment where we lose reserve status in the US dollar. That's my opinion. But as you're moving along, if you're moving from one jurisdiction to another and you find that one's more prevalent than the other, you will not lose the value of your money, because you'll already have it in the form of gold. You'll be able to just plug it into the currency that they're using in that jurisdiction. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the big advantages of having gold and silver.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that's interesting to me, Bernie, is when I was a kid, I remember, for example, seeing the James Bond movie Goldfinger, that was based around, of course, the ripping off Fort Knox, right? And but in recent years, I've been reading that countries like Canada and the United States have been selling off their gold, and at the same time, nations such as Russia and China have been acquiring gold, and in fact are intent upon returning to the gold standard as a basis for evaluating their currency. Do I have that correctly? Is that a trend that you see happening geopolitically right now?
Absolutely. Well, I honestly think that we are in more of a currency war than we are. Yeah, there's a kinetic war between Russia and Ukraine going on right now, but I think there is much more of a currency war that is happening at the moment. I don't subscribe to the United States personally selling their gold. I believe it is in Fort Knox. I believe that it is still there. I know there's a lot of conspiracy theories out there that they've been selling off. I don't subscribe to that. But I absolutely agree with the other side of the equation, where China especially and a lot of other countries have been hoarding gold. I think the United States has abused its authority as a reserve currency, its privilege as a reserve currency. So what is created is an atmosphere that people are looking to make sure that at some future point they have an alternative to the US dollar. And I think there's a lot of discussions about that. And that's why I think that we're more in a currency war than we are in any other type of war at the moment. And I'm not in the camp either that China and Russia, and Russia is a really interesting case. I'm also not in the camp right now that believes that we're going to go to a gold standard anytime soon. I think a country like Russia will threaten that. They'll say, hey, I'll remind you that I've got enough gold to support the ruble while you're putting all these sanctions on. And look what happened to Russia this last month when all of the sanctions came in and they insisted, and Russia insisted on being paid in rubles. One of the things that they did, so this is how they got around some of the sanctions, is to strengthen the ruble. They did one of two things. They said, look, we're going to offer to buy gold at a minimum amount of rubles to their local domestic audience, to their mines and to their citizens. And it immediately strengthened the ruble. They didn't even have to go to the nuclear option of going to a gold exchange. And some people misunderstood that as Russia going back to a true gold standard. And it wasn't that. To go to a gold standard, Russia would have had to have specifically stated that you bring us a ruble, we're going to give you so much gold. That's not what they did. What they did is we're going to offer to buy gold with so many rubles and put a floor on gold. But a gold standard is you bring us a note and we're going to give you so much gold. They haven't gone there. They are openly talking about doing that. But I think that's more as a shot across the bow the countries and the international community that is putting sanctions on them, and that had the desired effect without them going to a gold standard. I think that option would so overvalue the ruble or the Chinese yuan if they went to that, it would completely upset the apple cart. And it would not be constructive for those countries, and it wouldn't be constructive for the United States and the global economy. So I am not subscribing to us going back to a gold standard anytime soon. However, when you have gold, you can still sustain the level of your fiat currency with the ability to convert. I'm of the opinion that if the United States were ever to lose its privilege or threatened or had the chance or the risk, I should say, of losing its reserve currency, they would in fact go back to a gold standard. They have enough gold to compete with Russia and Iran, Russia and China right now. So I see it more as a slow return to a gold standard eventually, but I don't believe that is imminent. It's going to require a bigger crisis than what we're going through today. But it does put Russia and specifically China in a really good negotiating position if and when the time ever comes. And I don't think to be shy in using that as leverage, but I don't believe they'll go back to a gold standard. That's just my opinion, but I don't believe they are. But the ability to be able to give credibility to your currency by just stating that you might is incredible, and that goes to prove the value of having a gold reserve.
So coming back to Canada, though, for a second, and I saw a funny meme today, which had Justin Trudeau in a sort of a James Bond pose, and it went something like this: Agent 007, zero intelligence, zero integrity, and 7% inflation. I've been reading that Canada has been selling off a lot of its gold deposits. Is that true? And if that is true, do you think that should be something of concern to Canadians in terms of destabilizing our domestic economy?
Yes, because we're in a currency war, I think it would be, obviously, if I was in charge of the Treasury, I would absolutely be acquiring some gold. Let's go back to the theory. Canada, when they started selling their gold, and I think we have 72 ounces on the balance sheet. I have clients that buy more than that in a day.
Wow. In the whole country, 72 ounces?
72 ounces, yeah, wow. That's my understanding. And so I believe it is true that we have sold off our gold. But what the Canada theorized that we have so much gold on the ground that if we really need it, we can go out and dig it. Well, or dig it up if we need it. The problem with that is it takes 10 years to constitute a mine and get the permitting and to get it out of the ground and to smelt it and to change it. So we are going to be really far behind the eighth ball if we get into a situation where the currency is so badly debased. Canada could be really behind the eight ball at that point in time. And again, for the people listening to our discussion today, the way you protect yourself against that is to have gold. Because again, in Canadian dollars, gold, and by the way, the gold in Canadian dollars is already at an all-time high. Because people focus on the dollar index and how Canada's dollar values against the US dollars. They forget that while that is going on, gold is actually at a record high in Canadian dollars today. You're going to see that gold is going to be worth that much more in Canadian dollars. And that's that hedge that we were talking about. That's what gives you that preservation of wealth. And of course, you can always sell it in US dollars. You don't have to sell it in Canadian dollars or in any currency that you really choose, depending on the jurisdiction that you're living in or you wish to do business or transact in. You can convert it to any currency. It is the international money.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I think people equate gold with instinctively is freedom. And based on what you've been talking about today, Bernie, we've gained a better understanding of why that's true. Because, the economically and politically, if we can possess this precious metal, it can open doors and it can really secure us financially against many of the risks that people are facing today. So if people wanted to open a precious metals account and begin investing in gold or silver or palladium or platinum, how would they do that? How would they get in touch with you in order if they wanted to do that?
Yeah, certainly. They're more than happy to give me a call directly. I'm happy to take client calls directly. My office line is 780-784-5995. If they prefer to email, I have a very simple email. It's bernie@WWPMC.com, which basically stands for Worldwide Precious Metals Canada.com. And I'm always happy to take calls or to schedule an appointment with a client or a phone call to discuss all the options that are available to them.
I should mention also, because I've visited that website many times, there's a real, pardon the pun, a real wealth of information there about precious metals and also other things. And also Worldwide Precious Metals also offers a very useful app that actually I read some of the journalistic articles that are published there regularly. So there really is a lot of information that's available there that I think people would find really, really useful, not only in the context of precious metals, but also just to understand, some of the topics that we've been discussing today around geopolitical events and economic trends. So we're at the part of the program here where we have taken a lot of Bernie's time. We're very grateful for it. I can say for myself, I've learned a lot. This is the part of the program, Bernie, where we try to send people off with a bit of a reading list so they can further their understanding of some of the topics that we've been talking about. I'm going to go first and let you finish off, if that's okay. I've chosen for today a book that you're probably familiar with. It's called The Richest Man in Babylon. It's a book that's been around for a really long time. It isn't specifically about gold, but it is about investing. The Richest Man in Babylon is considered as perhaps the greatest of all inspirational works on the subject of thrift, financial planning, and personal wealth, and revealed there are secrets to acquiring money, keeping money, and making money earn more money. And there are specific references in the book to gold. It's told. The story is told through a series of parables. They were originally published as a set of pamphlets, and then they were actually distributed by banks and insurance companies. And this book has been around for a really long time. It's written by a man named George Samuel Clayson, who was born in Louisiana in 1874, and it's just a very readable and actually entertaining book that introduces people to the concepts of investing, of saving money, and how to make wise financial decisions. And that's really what someone like Bernie helps you do. It helps you. People like Bernie are great because they have a deeper understanding of investment, of how money actually works, as we found out today. And we can really benefit from that wisdom if we pay attention and we listen, and also if we're humble. Because a lot of us think we know a lot about things like the stock market and precious metals and gold and investing. But when you talk to someone like Bernie, you find out most of us are pretty ignorant. So it's great to talk to people like Bernie. And this book is a great, let's say, introduction. It's certainly not a replacement for having a professional advisor like Bernie. But this is a book that I read, and actually it started me on a journey of my own. Towards thinking about how to achieve financial freedom, and it led me to people like Bernie. So that's why I highly recommend it. Bernie, do you have some suggestions that you can share with people taking in the podcast?
Right, and I want to add on that book, I think the big takeaway was pay yourself first. Wasn't that one of the big?
Absolutely, that is where it comes from. Yeah.
That's just fantastic. No, I'm glad you brought that one up. Well, I'm going to do something a little different. I do have a book, but I also want to share two videos that I think will really, really summarize what we're discussing today for people who want to do a deeper dive and want to do some self-learning and some self-improvement. And the first one that I'm going to recommend, and I believe I had also sent it to you at one time for one of your family members that was looking for some information.
Yes.
Right, and it's called What is a Wealth Cycle? The difference between price and value, and it's done by Mike Maloney. It's an older video. It's very short. It's about 12, 15 minutes long. I really recommend that people look at that video because it really does explain that it switches your mentality from pricing precious metals in fiat to pricing other assets in gold. So you really understand whether you're gaining value or not, or gaining ground or not. So I would really recommend that one.
Where would people find that, Bernie?
You know what? Would your producer Devin be able to put a link at the bottom of this?
I'm sure he can do that. Yep.
I'll forward it to you. And then just because the UR code is so complicated. And
there you go. See, Bernie, we have our own alchemist on staff. His name's Devin.
Absolutely incredible. And it is a really good video. The other one, and this one is far newer, and it talks more about the history, and it kind of, because the further back in history you look, the further in the future you can see, I think it's a Winston Churchill quote, and this one is The Principles for Dealing with the Changing World Order by Ray Dalio.
Yes.
Just a great, and that video is
funny. I just read that book, Bernie. Yeah.
It's a great book. And this video, for those who are busy, it just summarizes it in 30 minutes. And then, of course, for those that are really intrigued, they can go and they can drill right down into that book, and the details is absolutely unbelievable. So that's great. So I wanted to throw that in. Now my book, there we go. Here he goes again.
Yeah.
And I'm going to suggest, just because of what we're talking about today, is The New Case for Gold by James Rickard. He's a fabulous writer and author. He truly is an insider. I really appreciate his work. He's written a couple of different books. But for those who want to understand why they need to own physical precious metals in the times that we're living in today, I would suggest that you pick up that book and read it through. That would be my recommendation based on the subject that we have today.
Thanks so much, Bernie, for that and for those recommendations, and also for your time today. You know, you have a real talent for taking ideas, the things that are mystifying to those of us who are not financial people, and taking them out of the ether and bringing them down to a level we can understand. So we're very grateful for that, and also for your time today. Thanks so much for being a part of Gray Matter.
You're welcome. It's been a real pleasure, and thank you so much for your time as well, and what you do, Leighton. I truly do appreciate it.
Thanks, Bernie.